I am Walter, 68 years old, and I built houses for a living for over 4 decades before I finally understood that the sturdiest thing I ever constructed was my own capacity to be used. I spent my whole career as a general contractor, framing homes that would stand for 100 years, and I never once thought to check the foundation of my own family for rot. At 6:15 in the morning, my daughter texted me to say I was no longer welcome at her wedding rehearsal dinner, the one I had paid $41,000 to host, because her fiance's parents felt my blue-collar presence would embarrass them in front of their country club friends. I read the message once. I set my phone face down on the counter, and I smiled, because for the first time in 3 years, I finally understood exactly what my daughter thought I was worth. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from this morning, and if you've ever had people in your own family treat your generosity like it was owed to them. Hit that like button right now, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. The kitchen was quiet at that hour, the way it always is before the sun fully commits to rising. I sat at the round pine table I'd built with my late wife Margaret almost 30 years ago, back when we were young and broke and thought love alone could get us through anything. The coffee maker gurgled behind me, filling the room with that dark, bitter smell that had started every single day of my adult life. My tuxedo for tonight's rehearsal dinner hung pressed and ready on the closet door, still wrapped in plastic from the cleaners. I had rented the entire back terrace of the Windermere Country Club for this event. I had booked the string quartet. I had personally selected the wine list with the sommelier 3 weeks ago, spending an entire Saturday afternoon tasting reds I couldn't even pronounce, because my daughter Claire wanted the evening to feel, in her words, elevated. My phone buzzed against the wood, and the screen lit up the dim kitchen with a cold white glow. I expected a text from the caterer confirming the final head count, or maybe Claire double-checking the seating chart one more time, the way she'd been doing obsessively for weeks. Instead, the words on the screen hit me like a 2x4 to the chest. "Dad, please don't come tonight. Brendan's parents are old money, and they're already uncomfortable with how you talk and dress. It's one night. Please just let us have this without making it weird." I read it twice. Then a third time, just to make absolutely sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me at that hour. "Please don't make it weird." 4 words that told me everything I needed to know about the daughter I raised alone after Margaret passed, the daughter I put through a private university without a single student loan, the daughter I taught to ride a bike in the cul-de-sac of a house I built with my own 2 hands. Claire wasn't asking me to skip a dinner. She was asking me to disappear quietly so that Brendan Ashford, the third's parents, Richard and Patricia, wouldn't have to look at a man who once had calluses on his palms and sawdust on his boots. I set the phone down next to my coffee mug and did not shed a single tear. I did not type back some wounded, desperate paragraph begging to be included in my own daughter's celebration. Tears and pleading are tools for men who still believe they need permission to matter. I spent 42 years in construction, and if there's one thing that trade teaches you, it's this. When a beam is compromised, you don't weep over it. You cut it loose before it brings the whole structure down with it. For the better part of 2 years, ever since Claire started dating Brendan, I had watched something in her curdle. She used to call me every Sunday just to talk about nothing. She used to bring her laundry home, not because she needed to, but because she liked sitting in my kitchen while I worked in the garage. Then Brendan happened, and with him came Richard and Patricia Ashford, who owned 3 car dealerships and a vineyard in Napa, and apparently believed that owning things made you better than the people who built the things you owned. Claire started correcting the way I said certain words. She started apologizing to Brendan for my truck, for my flannel shirts, for the fact that I still ate dinner at 5:30 like a man who'd worked a real shift that day. And through all of it, she never once stopped calling me when the rent was short, or when Brendan's car needed a repair, or when she wanted a small loan that we both silently understood would never be paid back. I stared at that text message for a long 10 seconds. In that 10 seconds, 32 years of unconditional love for my only child evaporated into something colder and clearer. The little girl I taught to ride a bicycle, the young woman whose tuition I paid without a single complaint, quietly died in my mind right there at that pine table. In her place stood a stranger who had learned to be ashamed of the man who built the roof over her childhood. I opened the banking app on my phone. My thumb hovered for a moment over the wedding fund, the joint account I'd set up specifically for this event, the one holding the remaining balance for the venue, the caterer, and the florist, a total of $38,000 still pending release. The wedding itself, 3 weeks from now, at the vineyard the Ashfords owned. I had wired the deposit months ago as a show of good faith, but the final balance, the one that actually confirmed the booking, was scheduled to release automatically at 9 that morning. I tapped into the account settings. I found the pending automatic transfer and pressed cancel. A warning popped up, informing me that halting the transfer this close to the event could result in the loss of the deposit and jeopardize the reservation. I confirmed anyway, without a flicker of hesitation. The screen refreshed, and the $38,000 slid quietly back into my account like water returning to its source. I did not stop there. I opened the supplementary credit card I had given Claire 2 years ago, the one meant for gas and groceries that had somehow paid for a designer wedding dress, a bachelorette trip to Cabo, and a spa day for the entire bridal party. I selected deactivate, marked it as lost, and locked the primary account behind it. The digital latch clicked shut on the screen with a small, satisfying finality. The financial cord that had quietly fed my daughter's new life for 2 years was now severed for good. I put the phone face down on the table and breathed in slow through my nose. My chest felt lighter than it had in months. I picked up my coffee and took a long sip, and it tasted like something I hadn't tasted in years. Freedom? Maybe. Or just the truth, finally sitting still long enough for me to swallow it. I knew exactly what would happen in a few hours. Claire and Brendan would call the venue to confirm final details for tonight, and the coordinator would inform them, politely but firmly, that the balance hadn't cleared, and the reservation was now on hold pending payment. I could already picture Claire's face, the exact shade of pale it would turn. They wanted a celebration without me in it. I decided they could go ahead and have that celebration entirely on their own dime. I finished my coffee, stood up, and walked past my tuxedo hanging on the closet door. I did not take it down. My rehearsal dinner was canceled, but my work for the day was only just beginning. 2 hours after I locked that credit card, I was still in the kitchen when my phone lit up on the counter, screen flashing with a name I hadn't seen appear in weeks. Claire. I let it ring 4 times before I answered, and when I did, I could hear the panic in her breathing before she even said a word. "Dad," she said, her voice already cracking, "there's some kind of problem with the venue. They're saying the payment didn't go through. Can you just call them and fix it? The rehearsal starts in 6 hours." I looked out the kitchen window at my quiet backyard, at the maple tree Margaret and I had planted the year Claire was born. "There's no problem with the payment, Claire," I said, my voice steady as poured concrete. "I canceled it myself." The silence on the other end of the line stretched out so long I thought the call had dropped. "What do you mean you canceled it?" she finally whispered. "Dad, the deposit, the venue, everything is booked around that payment. You can't just—" "I can, and I did," I said. "You made it very clear this morning that my presence tonight would embarrass the people you're trying to impress. So I removed myself from the evening entirely, the way you asked. And since I'm no longer part of tonight, my money isn't part of it either." I heard her breath catch, and behind it, muffled but unmistakable, Brendan's voice asking what was happening. Then a second voice, older, sharper, that I recognized as Richard Ashford, demanding to know why the venue coordinator was on hold. "Dad, please," Claire said, her composure cracking wide open. "You can't do this to me, not today." I felt nothing resembling guilt, only the clean, quiet certainty of a man who has finally stopped propping up something that was never going to hold weight on its own. "You are 30 years old, Claire," I told her. "You wanted a celebration with people who value appearances more than the man who raised you. I suggest you ask them to help you pay for it." I ended the call. I opened her contact and pressed block. I did the same for the number I had saved for Brendan 2 years ago, back when I still believed he might turn out to be a decent man. The digital door closed, and on the other side of it, they were now entirely alone with the consequences of their own arithmetic. I knew Richard Ashford's type well enough from 30 years of building homes for men exactly like him. He would never allow his son's rehearsal dinner to collapse in front of his golf buddies and business partners. He would write the check himself before he'd allow that kind of public embarrassment. But the moment he did, the entire architecture of that relationship would shift, because Brendan would no longer be the promising young man marrying into a comfortable inheritance. He would be the son-in-law who couldn't cover his own wedding costs, indebted to a father-in-law who already looked at him like something he'd scraped off his shoe. But I couldn't sit in my kitchen and simply wait for the fallout. Canceling that payment was only the opening move. They had spent 2 years slowly writing me out of their future, while still expecting me to fund it, assuming I would just absorb the humiliation quietly and keep the checkbook open. I walked into my home office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk, where I kept a folder I'd been avoiding for exactly this reason. For the past 4 years, a developer named Priya Malhotra had been sending me letters, each one more aggressive than the last, trying to buy the 5 acres my house sat on. My neighborhood had become valuable for a reason I never cared about, something to do with a new highway interchange going in 2 miles down the road. Developers wanted to level these old properties and put up storage facilities and strip malls. I found her card in the stack of unopened mail, dialed the number, and she picked up on the second ring, her voice sharpening the instant I introduced myself as the man who owned the corner lot on Birchwood Lane. I told her I was ready to sell, but on my terms. 24 hours, cash closing, no inspections, no contingencies. I'd take a straight 15% below market to make it happen that fast. She went quiet for a long moment, clearly running numbers in her head, then asked what the catch was. I told her there wasn't one, only a deadline. She had 10 seconds to accept before I called the competing firm 2 towns over. She agreed before I finished counting. I hung up and looked around the living room where Claire had taken her first steps, where Margaret and I had spent 30 Christmas mornings, where I had built the built-in bookshelves along the far wall with my own hands the same year Claire was born, sanding and staining every plank myself over 3 long weekends. Claire used to say she'd keep this house forever, that she'd raise her own kids in it someday. That was before Brendan started calling it quaint in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. Before Patricia Ashford toured it once and asked, in front of me, whether I'd ever considered updating the kitchen to something less rustic. My laptop chimed with a new email while I waited for the paperwork from Priya, and the name in the subject line made my jaw tighten. It was from Richard Ashford. Not a phone call, not a text, a formal, capitalized, furious email, demanding I immediately wire $41,000 to cover the venue and catering costs he claimed he'd been forced to personally guarantee to save his son's rehearsal dinner from complete collapse. He wrote that a man of his standing did not appreciate being made to look foolish because of what he called my petty tantrum. He threatened that if the funds weren't in his account by morning, he would personally ensure I never saw my grandchildren whenever Claire and Brendan eventually had them, and that he'd make certain every person in his social circle knew exactly what kind of vindictive old man I was. I read every hostile word twice, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face, because Richard Ashford, without meaning to, had just handed me a written attempt at extortion, dated and time-stamped. I did not reply. Arguing with a man drunk on his own self-importance is a waste of breath. I forwarded the email straight to my attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Denise Farrow, who had handled my business contracts for 15 years and had been quietly urging me for months to update my estate planning before Claire's new family finished rewriting themselves into it. With that sent, I walked back into the living room, retrieved the heavy-duty crowbar from my garage, and stood in front of the bookshelves Margaret and I had built together. I remembered, with sudden clarity, a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear 6 months ago, Claire and Brendan standing in this exact spot, Claire telling him that the first thing they'd do once they inherited the house was gut this whole wall and put in something sleek and modern that Patricia would actually approve of. Brendan had laughed and agreed that my life's work looked like something from a cabin catalog. I wedged the crowbar behind the first shelf and pulled. The wood cracked and splintered, and I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. I wasn't destroying a memory. I was dismantling a monument to their entitlement before they ever got the chance to. I tore down shelf after shelf, breaking the boards over my knee, filling trash bags with 30 years of craftsmanship they'd already decided was garbage. It took me less than an hour, and by the end, sweat soaking through my shirt, I felt lighter than I had in years. My phone rang just as I finished, and it was Denise, her voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard from her. "Walter," she said, "we have a situation. Your bank's fraud division just called my office directly. Someone attempted to access your primary retirement account online 40 minutes ago, using your correct answers to 2 security questions before getting locked out by a new authentication step." My grip tightened on the phone. My retirement account held nearly everything Margaret and I had saved across 3 decades. "Who?" I asked, though some cold part of me already suspected the answer. "The IP address traces to a residential address in the Ashfords neighborhood," Denise said. "Walter, only one person in that circle would know your mother's maiden name and the street you grew up on. Brendan." Not Claire, not Richard, but Brendan, sweating somewhere in that vineyard house, trying to break into my life savings to cover the debt he now owed his own father. He wasn't just a coward hiding behind his fiance's family. He was actively trying to steal from the man he was supposedly about to call his father-in-law. Did they get anything? I asked, my voice dropping low. Nothing, Denise confirmed. The account is frozen solid until you show up in person with ID. But Walter, you need to understand what just happened. This isn't a family disagreement anymore. This is attempted computer fraud, and it's documented. I looked down at the trash bags full of broken shelving and thought about the boy Brendan had pretended to be at every family dinner. Polite, ambitious, respectful. That mask was gone now, and underneath it was someone willing to commit a federal crime to protect his own pride. Let him keep trying, I told Denise. Document everything. I have a feeling he isn't finished making terrible decisions today. I hung up and carried the crowbar back to the garage, already knowing what I'd do next. The demolition crew from Priya's firm would arrive first thing tomorrow morning, and I intended to leave absolutely nothing behind worth fighting over. By the time Priya's notary arrived that evening, with the closing paperwork spread across my kitchen table, the same table where I'd read that first devastating text 12 hours earlier, I signed without a single tremor in my hand. The wire transfer cleared 2 minutes later, a number with more zeros than I'd ever seen in one account, safely locked inside a new trust that neither Claire nor Brendan would ever have access to, no matter how many forged signatures they attempted. I packed exactly 2 suitcases, clothes, documents, and the photographs of Margaret that actually mattered. Everything else, including the designer sofa Claire had insisted Brendan buy on my card, I left exactly where it sat. I drove that night to a security-gated condominium downtown that I had quietly purchased 8 months earlier, the very week I first noticed small, unexplained withdrawals bleeding out of my accounts and understood, long before I wanted to admit it, that my daughter had learned to see me as a resource rather than a father. I sat in my new living room that night and pulled up the hidden camera feed I'd left running at the old house. Less than 2 hours after I signed the papers, Priya's demolition crew arrived, and I watched 6 men in hard hats tear that front door off its hinges with crowbars, drag the pristine white sofa out onto the ruined lawn, and shatter the glass coffee table against the front steps for easier disposal. Neighbors stood on their porches in stunned silence, watching 30 years of my life get reduced to splinters and dust in under an hour. I felt nothing but a strange, settled peace, the feeling of a man finally putting down a weight he never should have carried alone. 14 days later, I sat parked down the street from what used to be my house, watching Claire and Brendan step out of a rideshare car in front of a lot that no longer had a house on it, just a mountain of debris in a rented dumpster and a chain-link fence with orange construction signs. Claire stood frozen on the cracked sidewalk, staring at the wreckage of the only childhood home she'd ever known. Brendan, beside her, looked pale and gaunt, clearly having spent 2 miserable weeks under Richard Ashford's roof paying off a debt with nothing but resentment as interest. He walked up to the fence and rattled it uselessly, as if sheer will could undo what had already been done. Claire dropped to her knees in the dead grass and began to sob, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt the faintest flicker of something like sorrow, quickly extinguished by the memory of 4 simple words. Please don't make it weird. A site supervisor stepped out from behind a construction trailer and told them plainly they were trespassing on private commercial property. Brendan, in a moment of pure desperation, pulled out his phone and called the police, screaming into the receiver that squatters had illegally demolished his father-in-law's house. 2 patrol cars arrived within minutes, lights flashing down the quiet street while neighbors gathered to watch. The responding officer reviewed the notarized deed the foreman produced, confirmed the property had been legally sold and the sale recorded, and informed Claire and Brendan they had exactly 1 minute to leave before they'd be cited for trespassing. I watched from my truck as they were escorted off a property that no longer belonged to either of them, standing on the public sidewalk with nothing but the 2 suitcases they'd carried to Napa and back. 3 days after that, I received formal notice through Denise's office that Claire and Brendan, backed by a scrappy young attorney working on contingency, had filed a civil suit against me, alleging wrongful eviction, emotional distress, and something laughably close to elder manipulation, claiming I'd been coerced by a predatory developer into a fire sale of the family home. Denise, when she called to tell me, could barely keep the amusement out of her voice. They want a mediation meeting, she said. They think you'll fold under pressure and write them a check just to make the embarrassment disappear. I told her to accept immediately. I walked into that mediation room 3 weeks later in a charcoal suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion, feeling sharper and steadier than I had in years. Claire and Brendan sat across the table with their young lawyer, who launched into a rehearsed speech about elder abuse and cruel abandonment, sliding a settlement demand across the table with more zeros than my patience could tolerate. Denise didn't raise her voice. She simply opened her briefcase, slid a tablet across the polished wood, and let their attorney read, in silence, the bank's fraud report detailing the attempted unauthorized access to my retirement account, traced directly to an IP address inside the Ashford residence, time-stamped the exact evening of the failed rehearsal dinner. Their lawyer's face drained of color as he read further, discovering evidence his own clients had clearly never disclosed to him. He turned to Brendan with open disgust, informing them both that he could not, in good conscience, continue representing clients who'd concealed an active fraud investigation from him. He withdrew on the spot, gathering his files and walking out without a backward glance, leaving Claire and Brendan alone at that table with no lawyer, no leverage, and no house to inherit, having just signed, in their panic, an ironclad release of any future claim to my estate. I walked out of that building into the afternoon sun, feeling lighter than I had in years, the weight of 2 years of quiet erosion finally, fully lifted from my shoulders. In the parking lot, I watched from a distance as Richard Ashford confronted his son, demanding repayment for the money he'd fronted, and Brendan, with nothing left to lose, finally turned his fury on Claire instead, blaming her entirely for costing him an inheritance he'd never actually earned. Their engagement dissolved right there on the hot asphalt. Two people who had spent 2 years building a future on someone else's foundation, watching it collapse the moment the funding stopped. 6 months have passed since that boardroom went silent. I live now in a quiet condominium downtown, mornings spent on my balcony with black coffee and a view of a city skyline I never imagined I'd call home. My days are simple and entirely my own, filled with woodworking projects in a small rented workshop, long walks, and the particular peace that comes from no longer being anyone's safety net. Last week, a message arrived from an unknown number. A long, desperate paragraph from Claire, describing a cramped apartment, a canceled engagement, a job she'd lost after the fraud investigation surfaced in a background check on Brendan, and a plea, buried at the very end, hinting she could use some help with rent this month. I read it once, felt nothing stir beneath my calm, and deleted the entire conversation before blocking the number for good. True family was never something I owed unconditionally to anyone who saw me only as a resource. It's something built with the same care and patience I once gave to every house I ever framed, plank by plank, on a foundation of respect that has to run in both directions, or it isn't a foundation at all. If any part of this story reminded you of your own family, tell me about it below, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one still to come.